Good morning, everyone. I'd like to begin by reading to you my thesis statement. Classical education is superior to non-classical education because it is historically proven to be successful, developmentally suited to its students, and intentionally designed to create mature men and women. Classical education is not new. Its roots stretch back to Greek and Roman foundations, and key aspects of classical education existed even before that. Because of the success of this educational system, its legacy continued for centuries. Classical education was the primary, unquestioned method of schooling up until roughly the 1950s, when the progressive model began to dominate American education. Because of its assimilation into American education and culture, this progressive model accounts for much of why classical education may seem foreign, ancient, or even impractical to the modern educator or student or parent. However, classical education is truly the historical past of education, and it has endured the test of time because of its core. Classical education is superior to non-classical education because it is historically proven to be successful, developmentally suited to its students, and intentionally designed to create mature men and women. First, classical education is superior to other forms of education because it is historically proven to be successful. In order to begin, it is critical to provide a brief background both on classical education and its aims in order to summarize historical points and define complex terms. Christopher Perrin does this in his work in Introduction to Classical Education, defining education as, quote, that vast undertaking of passing on the wisdom and knowledge of one generation to another. It involves discovery, but also instruction. It is cultural transmission. Additionally, it is important to recognize that classical education has not remained completely stationary since its earliest origins. Rather, it has ebbed and flowed with time periods and movements. So, for instance, during the Enlightenment period, there was a greater emphasis on logic and reasoning as the emphasis of the self was incorporated more into education. And then during the Reformation time, there's a greater emphasis on biblical teaching and incorporation of the Bible and truth. By the time of the Middle Ages, classical education had already experienced design and reform over a period of roughly 2,000 years, and its contemporaries nearly universally recognized its deep value and unrivaled results. Many of the greatest minds of the last 3,000 years were classically educated, and many of them were additionally advocates of the classical approach. For instance, Martin Luther and John Calvin both promoted classical learning by actually starting their own classical schools. Other examples include Abraham Lincoln, Oliver Wendell Holmes, William Jennings Bryan, G.K. Chesterton, C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, James Madison, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and Thomas Jefferson, to name a few. Beyond influential individuals, thriving societies were also based on classical education, including those of the Greeks, Romans, early Europeans, and Americans up until the early 20th century. Now, many academics today could argue that there is a new world of changing educational institutions, technological availabilities, and altered moralities that sort of all call for new means of education and new means of educating systems. Educational changes, many progressives argue, should be designed to meet standards, pass tests, and simply move individuals on to the next level. However, while there may be some truth to their claims about the purpose of 21st century education and its corresponding changes, there really are no indications that any contemporary non-classical education format have been nearly as effective. For example, North Carolina schools have tumultuously transitioned from one system of education to another over the last 3 decades, implementing programs such as the Performance-Based Accountability Program, the ABCs of Public Education, the Excellent Schools Act of 1997, the Performance-Based Licensure Program, the Common Core Program, which is already slated to be discontinued for this upcoming 2015-2016 academic year, and a State Board of Education strategic plan that has undergone and is currently undergoing significant change. It is clear that apart from classical education, no single educational format has been able to remain relatively constant. Second, classical education is superior to non-classical education because it is developmentally suited to its students. This is a step towards efficiency and efficient learning, as educational strategies specifically aimed for certain ages reduce difficulty for both the teacher and the student. At this point, it is imperative to reference Dorothy L. Sayers and Susan Wise Bauer. And these are two figures that are really prominent leading individuals in the revival of classical education of the 20th century and really the 21st century too. Dorothy L. Sayers, I wish there was more time to talk about her because she really did almost everything, but she wrote extensive poetry, she wrote crime fiction, she was one of the first women to ever receive a degree from Oxford. And Susan Wise Bauer is currently a professor at the College of William Mary, a professor of American English and Literature, and she also graduated at William and Mary. But both of these women really served to emphasize the trivium in classical education, which is really a core structure. Classical education essentially can be split into, or is comprised of the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium is Latin for 3 ways, and the quadrivium is Latin for 4 ways. And together they make up these 7 liberal arts. But because of the increasing emphasis of the trivium in modern classical education, that's really going to be our focus today. The trivium is the introductory system of verbal arts by which one learns principally how to learn. The trivium, Latin for 3 ways, again, is comprised of 3 stages: grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. Grammar consists of grades kindergarten through 5th grade. The emphasis of the grammar school is on memorization, identification, and association. So, for example, students of the grammar school are taught to associate capital cities with states, memorize math facts, or identify countries on a map. The next stage, it's also important to note that the grammar stage is really this setting of a foundation, getting the building blocks for higher education, that it's what you start with. Next is the dialectic stage. It's the shortest of the 3, grades 6 through 8. It's only 3 years. Dialectic education is focused on logic and reasoning, analysis, and debate. Essentially what classical education does is it takes the sometimes disagreeable tendency of young teenagers to be argumentative and channels that tendency to be kind of argumentative and asking why this, why that, and hey, we're going to teach you why. We're going to teach you basic reasoning skills. Classical education is going to emphasize basic logic skills. And really more than that, the dialectic school also serves as a sort of stepping stone from grammar to rhetoric. It's really a transitional period. Rhetoric is the capstone of the trivium, grades 9 through 12. It's the final stage. The emphasis of the rhetoric school is on persuasion and expression. Ideally, a rhetoric student would be able to both learn what he's being taught and be able to express it in his own words through writing and public speaking, so kind of like what I'm doing right now. There are 2 primary objections to the notion of the trivium, or developmentally suited education. The first is that a student should not be forced to study subjects within the bounds of an educational system if he does not plan to use that given subject in his intended career or lifestyle. So, for example, a student really strong in mathematics and science, why should that student be forced to memorize postmodernist poetry or study the specific dates and details of the Cold War? Well, classical education really opposes this idea well and refutes it with what I think is a pretty strong argument. Secondary schools and companies and colleges are really looking for bright students who are able to think maturely and logically and creatively and write well and reason well. Demonstrating keen tuition as opposed to merely being good at one given subject and being able to kind of work the system, or not even that as much as just being able to plug in the numbers and knowing what you're good at. But in addition to the fact that a student might not end up choosing a career in what he thinks he's going to choose a career in at the high school level, classical education really prioritizes the process and the fruits of learning as a whole, as opposed to a narrow analysis of each subject. And this idea is at the heart of the Trivium, this idea of subjects being interrelated and a progression of learning. The second primary objection, critics of Dorothy Sayers, Susan Wise Bauer, and the Trivium all contend that the completion of the final rhetoric stage instills in the student a false sense of finishing a finite process. So in other words, I've finished the rhetoric stage, I've been through the 3 stages, so I'm done. I did it. Like, I completed education. But there's really little to really almost no truth in this idea at all, and classical education really runs directly contradictory to this. Classical education aims to perpetually engage individuals in what is known as the great conversation, and this is an idea, it's this idea of there's a continual seeking of knowledge, the idea that I can never learn everything, so I'm just going to add to my knowledge and add to my wisdom. It's a continual process, and you never really finish it. It's a long-term goal, and the discussion of these long-term goals and objectives lead to classical education's most important tenet and my final point, the creation of men and women, lifelong learners. Finally, classical education is superior to non-classical education because it is intentionally designed to create mature men and women, as opposed to attempting to create machine-like students with objectively measurable skills or abilities. In their work, Classical Education, The Movement Sweeping America, Jean Edward Veith and Andrew Kern summarize this idea. Quote, their Greek and Roman instruction was aimed at cultivating within individuals what we now call the whole person. If education is not merely an installation of facts and knowledge that can be objectively graded or assessed, but rather an entire cultural transmission, as we previously stated, then one must additionally incorporate certain attributes or values to also be a part of education. Wisdom and virtue are at the heart of these values. Wisdom is best seen in the academic setting, both through a desire to learn and an understanding that grades and learning are not necessarily perfectly, there's not always this perfect correlation between learning and grades. You can learn material really well and test poorly because the test was written poorly or because you didn't get enough sleep the night before, or you can also not learn material really well and cram it or know what the test is going to be like and really ace the test, but then maybe even forget it the next day. It's just this idea that wisdom expresses a concept of learning being more important than grades. Although grades are often a great indication of learning, it's not perfect correlation. Douglas Wilson, author of Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning, which is actually a response to Dorothy Sayers' The Lost Tools of Learning. Anyway, Wilson writes, quote, a sure mark of an effective classical education is a love for learning. If a child is taught well, he will not only learn the information, he will also come to love both the process of learning and the knowledge itself. Secondly, there is virtue. David Hicks, authors of Norms and Nobility, a treatise on education, writes, quote, virtue, after all, is not a parlor game, but a perpetual activity. And an education that fails to prepare man for the life of virtue robs him as a youth of his chance to receive who he is and what his purposes are. The idea of perpetual activity, again, is referencing the continuity of classical education, the idea that I can never learn everything, but I'm just adding to my knowledge and my wisdom. The Trivium is not a finite process. Learning is not a finite process. Wisdom and virtue are continual pursuits and foundational to life, and there is no reason to separate them from education. While most academics would not oppose the teaching of wisdom and virtue, There are many that argue that there is a need for some objectively measured standards in order to evaluate student, teacher, and school performance. In other words, there is a really pressing need for grades, standardized test scores, college acceptance ratings, graduate school acceptance ratings, school rankings, and essentially any other way to, across the board, compare school to school, teacher to teacher, and student to student. However, the problem does not lie in the use of these standards so much as the over-prioritization of these standards. The priorities of classical education are the desire to learn, the improvement of wisdom, and the cultivation of virtue. These are all subjective and immeasurable pursuits. However, that is not to say that classical education is without demonstrated statistical results. In fact, it is the opposite. Christopher Perrin lists a few of these statistics in an introduction to classical education. Perrin writes, "Students around the nation in classical schools typically score in the top 10 to 15% on national tests like the Stanford Achievement Test and the Scholastic Aptitude Test," and that's the SAT. "Established classical schools often graduate a significant proportion of national merit scholars and students with extremely competitive SAT scores in the top 5%. College acceptances and ratings are additionally impressive." Perrin writes, "Classically educated seniors have no trouble getting into good colleges. Many qualify for highly selective colleges and universities, and a good number receive merit scholarships and other scholarships. Colleges around the nation have shown an interest in these students and have familiarized themselves with the classical approach and curriculum currently being recovered in the United States. Finally, and most convincingly, classical education is growing rapidly." Perrin writes, "Classical schools are growing at a robust rate. It is not unusual for new classical schools to grow by 25 to 30 students per year. There are currently about 150 schools in the ACCS. The ACCS is the Association of Classical and Christian Schools. It's one of the more prominent organizations of classical education. There are currently about 150 schools in the ACCS, with new schools starting at a rate of about 10 to 20 per year. In summary, while classical education is not chiefly concerned with statistics or objective results, it excels in those areas nonetheless." Okay, to summarize, or to review, classical education is superior to non-classical education because it is historically proven to be successful, developmentally suited to its students, and intentionally designed to create mature men and women. Historically proven to be successful, we looked at some of the greatest minds of the last 3,000 years, and the fact that some of the most thriving societies in all of history were founded and largely associated with classical education. Developmentally suited to its students, that's the trivium, the structure of classical education: grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. And then the creation of mature men and women, as opposed to machine-like students with objectively measurable skills. The idea that wisdom and virtue, there's no reason to separate them from education. They're continual pursuits and they're foundational to life. From a biblical perspective, it is honorable and desirable to embrace the educational format that honors God both through a well-rounded study of Him and the world He created. Ultimately, this rests on the truth of Colossians 3:23, which reads, "Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as if serving the Lord and not human masters." If education is one's field, whether as a student, a teacher, a parent of a student, or an administrator, the Lord is asking for all of our hearts, and classical education truly offers the best means to that continual pursuit. Thank you.